like to call on the leader of RP here.
Just checking I can be heard. I'll take POIs in.
Did they drop out?
It appears so.
I think we'll just wait for them to come back.
Yeah, they just texted saying they dropped out. They're rejoining now.
Probably got too excited. We'll just wait.
Sorry about that. My laptop just kind of shat itself for no real reason. Carry on, Branko.
Take your paper.
Sorry.
Don't worry.
Sorry about that, guys. It just went. The screen just went black all of a sudden. And
Did they just drop out again? Yeah.
Apparently so. Bella, can you text and find out what's up?
Yep, sorry, I just was doing that. They're joining off of a new laptop now.
Okay.
hey, everyone. Can I be seen and heard? We've just changed laptops.
Yeah.
Oh,
Are
beautiful.
you guys good now?
Yeah, we should be. This is a new laptop. Our sincerest apologies. Oh, well. All right.
It's okay. Go ahead.
Thank you for the patience. And POIs in chat, as I said earlier. So the reason that OO will take this debate is through a relatively simple claim. Students are not just students. They're politicians, they're scientists, they're lawyers, they're researchers. The most important thing in this debate is how postmodernism impacts how society thinks, not the lives of these individual students. We will bring you robust claims about how this changes the fundamental ways in which society deals with issues and how that is so, so beneficial. Let's do three things in this speech. Firstly, postmodernism looks like. Secondly, on why postmodernism has allowed for important and novel areas of thought that lead to beneficial social policy and the individual characterization on what that obviously applies mostly in humanities, but it also does influence other areas of thought and epistemology within natural sciences too, in a meaningful way. All science is still rigorous and factual, and there's no undermining of truth in that sense. We still have really high quality science. What we do tell you is that it undermines or challenges the underlying assumptions in every single field, including both in theoretical fields as well as natural sciences fields. It challenges those assumptions and provides multiple perspectives in that way. With that out of the way, then, let's talk about the main thrust of our case at opening opposition, which is that postmodernism has allowed for important and new novel areas of thought, right? And when we say that this leads to new areas of thought, we mean that this bleeds into, not only research and teaching, but in terms of broader social analyses on how we conduct our social lives. Why then is it that postmodernism has been so beneficial in bringing about new and critical areas of thought? It is because postmodernist schools of thought have given rise to other frameworks that help us better understand our world and better understand ourselves. They do this by asking the fundamental question of understanding those differences, and this has been the genesis of so many other important social areas of research and social understanding within our lives. It is that understanding and that questioning of that universal truth that there are multiple that they are women, and they know that these structures have been put in place by men. Thirdly, in terms of economic schools of thought, right? These things oftentimes challenge capitalism because they ask the questions of, and when should the state intervene in private markets? Note just how much of classical economic theory is based on a hands-off approach, a liberal approach, whereas now when you have the movement of, the new way in the Tony Blair time of politics, that arose as postmodernism because you were able to do things like challenge the fact that those existing economic assumptions should not be, the things that always hold true. Colonization has fundamentally impacted the ways in which we understand our world. What are the crucial impacts then of a better and more robust understanding of how our world works? They are threefold. Firstly, it leads go into policy making. They're the people that make these actually achieve their goals and to actually articulate their to articulate their oppression. If they have different ways and better ways to advocate for themselves and be able to put into words exactly what is the problem and what needs to be done to achieve an important solution, that is something that, postmodernism provides because it challenges the fundamental assumption that institutions are good in the way that they are now. No, postmodernism allows for you to think of other ways in which those might be reformed and allows social movements to help the majority understand what the issue is. Finally, though, this really importantly profoundly impacts scientific research. Not just how much of scientific research was really flawed until you had a postmodernist understanding of things, right? It was understood that the white man's medical realities are the medical realities of all other groups. Postmodernism has challenged the underlying assumption of this and has, said that maybe we should, research how things affect different genders or different races. This leads to a huge amount of medical benefits to all of society. It looks like, more appropriate medicalization or diagnoses of certain illnesses or ailments. It looks like more appropriate medication, and it looks like scientific research that is actually catered to the groups whose lives it is trying to alleviate. For all of those reasons, postmodernism has been hugely socially beneficial, and that is the clearest thing that we bring to you from OO. Before I move on, I'll take CG.
Surely the rise of a few Marxist scholars is massively outweighed by the rise of Trumpian populism and anti-immigration sentiment, because my experiences of hating immigrants are just as valid as yours.
I'll just ask you the question of who is the current US president. I don't think that Trumpian politics is the most important thing in this debate, just because it's not the most dominant form of politics. I would say that the things that we posit to you are the actual impacts of this sort of movement are the most important things in society. Let's now finally move on to the final substantive push from opening opposition, which is that postmodernism in higher education is beneficial for students, because not only does education, serve the role of teaching students, a content and, things, it teaches them how to think, frameworks that they can apply to the rest of their lives, not just to their educational capacities. What are the benefits to students? Noting this is directly responsive to opening government's material. 3 things. Firstly, postmodernism makes people far more empathetic to other people because they understand that other people can have legitimate differences of opinion and legitimately different understandings. It makes you far more compassionate for those others. Secondly, it teaches a really high degree of critical thinking to those students, right? There's a reason that there's been a shift from, the sort of black letter rote learning that we see to, a postmodernist form of learning that actually values critical thinking. That is sort of thing that leads to far better academic output on that side. But finally, we tell you that this makes universities far more inclusive spaces, because when people who are of minority backgrounds have been ignored in these spaces for so long, postmodernism makes them feel like they are included and welcome in these sorts of spaces, because they occupy, the non-traditional role that now are able to be included in this. To that extent, because we are so socially beneficial, and postmodernism has been the singular most important thing to beneficial public policy of the late 20th and 21st century, I've never been prouder to oppose.
Amazing. I would like to thank the Leader of Opposition for that fine speech and call on the Deputy Prime Minister here. CPM.
Hi, can you see me and hear me?
Yes, both.
Okay. Just a few seconds. Okay. I'll start with framing what this debate is about. 3 things to note. The first is this trend applies broadly to all social science subjects. So it looks like economics, political science, and philosophy, not just, a few liberal arts programs that very privileged individuals attend. So you include different thinkers with different theories in all programs. You critique all theories, versus on our side, you have an emphasis on traditional or mainstream theories. For instance, the classical theory in economics, you prioritize evidence and quantitative reasoning. Secondly, how does this really manifest? Firstly, as we told you, in terms of teaching, you're introducing different thinkers with different theories rather than focusing on general principles or derivations that go in depth. Secondly, in terms of evaluation, you focus on open-ended answer questions when you emphasize that everyone's perspectives are equally valid. So you have more qualitative rather than quantitative papers that examine the validity of different perspectives. This is what the debate is about, because it's a broad phenomenon that applies to different fields. Finally, on liberal arts degrees, this is the minority of instances, because there is a declining number of liberal arts students to begin with, due to the general economic downturn we see in the status quo and people's general focus on consumerism and materialism. These students, who know that they won't get high-paying jobs after they graduate, are often quite privileged to begin with. It's unclear why we should care to a large extent about them. But I'll talk more about liberal arts degrees in my speech. I'm going to talk about three issues. First, on social justice. Second, on the quality of education. Finally, on academia. First, on social justice. I have three responses to opening opposition's push. Number one is, if all views are recognized to be valid under postmodernism, then they don't get any of the progressive change they advocate for in society. This is for three reasons. One, you have classical degendered theories on our side, which advocate for equality and just sort of take gender out of classical theory and advocate treating people in the same way. Whereas on their side, when there are feminist theories emerging, there are also anti-feminist theories. You also furthermore criticize feminist theories and deconstruct everything, and by doing so, you trivialize the importance of different views, because you sort of falsely inculcate a centrist bias into people when you say that every single view matters equally, when some ideologies just don't pass the basic plausibility test of being effective in reality. On the comparative, you can still recognize the importance of uplifting women. For instance, the economic benefits of this. For instance, the classical theory of autonomy or rights, etc. So, like, look at the work of the winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics this year. Flip this, furthermore, there is still a bar for accepting explanations and theories, because in academia, you just don't accept every single explanation as plausible. On their side, this bar becomes much more arbitrary, because on our side, we apply a single uniform and standardized sort of metric to evaluate which ideas are acceptable and which ideas conform to our theory. On their side, you default to biases about which theories are more acceptable and more valid when you artificially do not set up the bar. This is where implicit cultural assumptions that minorities are not familiar with disadvantage them. Finally, our side benefits social justice for a couple of reasons. Number one, if there is less investment in liberal arts programs on our side, if they teach fewer things, we think it's totally fine. For more minorities to go into STEM actually probably makes them wealthier and pushes for better political change. Secondly, liberal arts programs are probably less stigmatized and more accessible on our side, because there's a perception that you're learning something that's useful, you're acquiring skills. It's not mere affirmation of your identity. You also get more acceptance from society when the views you're advocating are not Marxism, but something that people can relate to. All this indicates there's likely more support for these programs if they are good. Finally, I would suggest that more pragmatism in politics is good, because current academic theories are very confusing to the average person. They're locked up in an ivory tower. There is a wide variety of theories that exist in a vacuum people do not apply or interact with in reality. Whereas on our side, you direct that capital towards focusing on what policies empirically best create equality, best maximize utility for society, and uplift minorities. They've never given you a single mechanism why the abstract radical theories people learn will translate into any meaningful political change. Second issue then, on better education. Our case was essentially that people learn better and become much more motivated on our side for a couple of reasons. Number one, as we told you, it's just more simplistic and easier to learn, right? You're learning fewer things when you're prioritizing traditional or classical theory. So you get a more solid grasp of what they actually mean, what the underlying mechanisms are. And this is crucial because you need to understand the functional mechanisms of these theories to be able to criticize them. On their side, you're criticizing everything without actually understanding the nuances. On the comparative, you trivialize theories. There is a false centrist bias that says every single theory has flaws, every single theory is equally valid. So that means you're less willing to explore things in depth on their side, and you learn fewer things. Secondly, there is a larger sense of fulfillment on our side when you engage in education, because you feel like you're making progress, you're approaching the truth, you feel like your degree actually is teaching you something, whereas on their side, you're just learning a response to every response to every response, and therefore you don't feel like your degree has value. Thirdly, you just learn better on our side, because on their side, when you have open-ended questions to exams, then you don't need to solidly understand things, you can just bullshit your way out of things. It is on our side where you actually need to learn something. What is the impact of this? Firstly, people just become more informed, and this is quite important for political decisions, especially in fields like political science and economics, where the things that people learn actually influence how they vote. There are like very strong anti-market biases and things that people are indoctrinated with in higher education in the status quo due to the lack in emphasis on empirical evidence and traditional theories. Secondly, people have more positive interactions with universities on their side. So more people going to research, people study harder universities, their degree matters more to them, they have a more pleasant experience, all of these things. Finally, I'll talk about academia. Before that, CO.
How do you test the
Oh,
applicability of academia to public policy? It's obviously just quantitative testing. A government never implements things that are BS. Rather, we explain this influences the way in which governments think in a more beneficial way.
No, but the examination of policy or the determination of what is the right thing to do happens on like multiple dimensions. It's not just like whether empirically it makes people happy. It's often like people develop principled justifications for things. People develop qualitative studies. We say that all of these things, which are much more likely to happen on their side, are less important than the more empirical evidence that we're going to examine on our side. Finally, on academia, note that education also shapes what academia looks like and how research occurs within the world, because these are the students that grow up to become future researchers. So when they focus on empirical evidence and the single classical theory, whereas on their side, the multifaceted postmodernist theory, there are three things that happen. Number one, it is more standardized. Everyone works toward the same direction. So you have more equality, more shared resources, and shared progress and collaboration with other researchers, which means more progress. Secondly, there's more accountability within academia. And this is crucial. When people use a single metric, it's much easier to determine than one that is arbitrary and determined by those in power. So when you have different qualitative papers that just propose theories on what we should do with the world that are abstract and philosophical, it's unlikely that you can arbitrate very effectively which are the good theories and which are the bad theories, and those with power, the big names with reputation in academia, are going to dictate this and stifle innovation. Finally, it is just more constructive for society, because on our side, when you focus on the objective theory and direct all attention towards things like optimization of utility, then you know what policy is most effective. You know what solutions we can develop for current political issues. For all of these reasons, very happy to propose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their fine speech and call on the DLO to conclude the opening half here.
Cool, just making sure I can be heard.
Yeah.
Awesome. This government bench says that they are choking on smoke, but cannot at any point over those two speeches, or I would suggest over the two speeches of closing government, point to where the fire is. We tell you at Branko, and I will spend the next 7 minutes telling you, that postmodernist theories, like critical race theory, like critical gender theory, like post-colonial studies, like developmental economics that actually takes into account the diverse experiences of the developing world, are some of the most important contributions to academia. It is an absolute privilege and a blessing that they are taught in the vast majority of universities the world over. Let's firstly address the two main claims that we've gotten from the government bench so far on accessibility and on, like, I guess, Trumpian weaponization. Then explain why this makes universities fundamentally better institutions, and then I'll spend Volko's speech explaining why it makes society better. Let's firstly talk about accessibility and weaponization, because the opening government says this makes things fundamentally inaccessible because exams are open-ended and like nobody knows how to teach this and nobody understands this. And this just says that whatever people's experience is true, which is just like a series of lies. Like, this is not how the world works right now. So and the first thing I'd say is just to interrogate the causal relationship with what these guys say is happening to universities and postmodernist theory. This is a series of theories that started in really developed in the back half of the 20th century and have developed now. And it just is not the case that universities are have assessments that don't work, have lectures that don't work, have completely inaccessible levels of workload. In fact, I would actually suggest that universities are some of the most accessible that they have ever been. And I would suggest that, for instance, allowing women en masse to enter universities, allowing people of color en masse to universities, directly coincided with the growing relevance of postmodern theories in a way that, like, honestly seems to suggest that just rote learning classical theories, being extremely competitive and sitting exclusively in a lecture theater with 500 other people was the less accessible form of university, and it was when you had what came before postmodernism. Second, it is just not hard. This team has tried to paint you an incredibly convoluted picture of what this is. It is not, there is no truth and nothing is real. It is, we should challenge the endemic structures that exist in the world around us. We should look at the bars of our cage, even if they are not immediately visible to us. We should accept that what is true for somebody else might not be what is true for me, and that when they tell you that their experience is different, when they tell you that they experience the world in a fundamentally different way than you do, that you should maybe believe them, that you should maybe give them the time of day. And if they can't prove that there's any basis in reality to that experience, then you don't have to you don't have to listen to them. But the fact is that postmodernist studies that examined the impact of redlining policies and examined the impact of several generations of people who were not allowed to generate wealth because they were enslaved, and what that did to Black people in the United States today, they were able to prove it. But the only reason that interrogation happened and was listened to was because because we considered that maybe the world wasn't what we thought it was, and maybe there wasn't an objective and scientific truth that just perfectly described and encapsulated people's experience, instead of ridiculous claims from this opening government team. Let's move on to closing government. Closing government say the classic Trumpian culture war fuckery line of, well, this just leads to a bunch of culture wars and a bunch of backlash and a bunch of people saying that, well, this is my experience and I'm a white man and you should care about this. The first thing I'd say is that there's just a temporal mismatch between this phenomenon and the rise of postmodernism, because like what has happened since the 2016 election is not the entirety of the set of postmodernist thought and that entire development of a scholarly field. Secondly, that there is a causal mismatch between people saying this is my experience and therefore you should listen to me, and like bad and oppressive outcomes that these people do. The reason that these people are able to do bad and oppressive outcomes is because they are socially empowered, is because they are white, is because they are male, is because they are wealthy, which are the precise things that postmodernist scholarship tells us to interrogate, and then we do. And thirdly, it is just a factual, like it is so intensely implausible that this is largely what people do. These people come from part of society who consider this school of thought to be illegitimate, and it just is not what postmodernism is. Let's move on to why this makes universities better. It does so in three ways. Firstly, it encourages a lot of interdisciplinary studies, usually between things that are considered harder social sciences or hard sciences and softer social sciences. So, for instance, it encourages a lot of interdisciplinary play between anthropology and economics, or anthropology and law, gave rise to a series of disciplines that examine things in their cultural context and then their historical context. Wouldn't have happened otherwise. Second, it made them more welcoming places because it platformed more people with diverse background, because that's what they were looking for explicitly. Made students feel like it was actually relevant to them because it resonated with them when they were from a racial minority, when they were a woman, and lastly because it actually evened the playing field in these academic debates, because it allowed for empirical analysis to be done on the claims that postmodernists were making that countered the empirical claims that had always been made by the people who were not postmodern. And honestly, it is just a repayment for the enormously harms that universities have done when they tested gynecological surgery on Black women with no anesthetic because they insisted that it was a biological reality, that they couldn't feel pain. These are the institutions that have poisoned the well. They deserve to have to clean it up. I'll take CG.
Do you think criminal justice policy should be made on the basis of actual crime figures, or the fact that white people...
No, and you asked the wrong person for this, buddy, because I've done a criminology degree for the last 4 years, and it absolutely should be made based off of Indigenous knowledge systems, especially in this country and the world over. It should be based in a racialized understanding of post-colonial history. It absolutely should include those things. I don't care what the crime figures say. I don't care that Indigenous people in this country are multiple times more likely to commit an offense. I do not think that makes them any more criminal than you or I. Lastly, then, let's explain why this makes society better. Why? And the first thing it does is that it encourages an intense degree of cultural sensitivity. And it secondly encourages the reflexive use in public of analysis and of different perspectives, public policy design that's influenced by research that is done in higher education, that's used by policy think tanks to create that policy, by actual policymakers who have learned these studies and now work in government. And it is what encourages reflexivity. It is what gives people the capacity that matches their incentive when they want to do good public policy. It allows for the critique of dominant theories and power relationships that exist in many other types of institutions, like criminal justice, like international development economics, that tells you that the only way to develop is to liberalize and allow yourself to be sold out to the West for the lowest possible margin. That is what it allows you to challenge. It draws your attention to the power dynamics there. Lastly, allows activist movements the tools to conduct their outreach. It looks like critical race theory. It looks like post-colonial studies. And I want every member of this panel to, at the end of this debate and the end of this speech, ask yourself, are you grateful for frameworks of knowledge that have told you that maybe your race isn't a biological reality and is a social construction that people have impressed on you and have reinforced throughout history? Is your gender a social construction that people have put you into a category on? And maybe it isn't an immutable truth about you and you can express your gender how you want. Maybe being a woman defines your experience because the world around you was built for men. Sincerely ask yourself whether you are grateful for those theories, and then word opening opposition.
Amazing. Thank you very much for that fine speech. And with that, we've come to the end of the opening half. Would now like to invite the member of government to continue the case for CG here.
Hey, POI's in the chat. I'll take you when you ask, I guess. I'm not gonna figure it out in ahead of time. 3 contributions from closing government: beating opening government by explaining in a better way why it's actually worse academia. Secondly, flipping opening opposition and explaining why the counterfactual is in fact more diverse. And third, explaining why this has effectively been used against universities. Let's start with why it's worse academia. And this is the fact that it's worse academic teaching. This is the fact that it's worse academic research, because those are tightly linked. Teachers and students disproportionately make up the set of people who do the research. Opening government has 3 claims for why this is worse academia. The first is a fairly implausible one, that people will simply stop trying to seek the truth. The second is that this is simply too complicated to understand, which I think opening opposition fairly points out is probably untrue, given that it's a framework that legitimizes like what your perspective on it is, so legitimizes your existing understanding. The third one is better, which is this will be in the same framework, and therefore those ideas can compete and make themselves better. The problem with this is that it buys into what opening opposition says, which is that there is going to be a hegemony of ideas. What we will point out is not that they are having the same framework and compete, but that they will exist in different frameworks and still compete with each other. Those different frameworks can compete more. And the structural reason why there's more of an incentive to compete on our side is that on their side, feminist and Marxist critiques can be equally valid and reach different conclusions and just say, we are coming at this from different perspectives. There's no universal truth. There can be a Marxist truth. There can be a feminist truth. But on our side, there can only be one truth. Marxist and feminist critiques are competing to get there. And that means that those critiques have an incentive to critique each other. And that process of competition between academic theories is what makes them better. The second reason why we get better academic theory is because postmodernism allows research and academia to get away without doing the necessary analytical work in order to justify it being true. Because you can import assumptions. You can say, this is a Marxist critique, and then I import all of the Marxist ideas, and I start with that as my starting point, and then do analysis from there and call it a Marxist mode of analysis, without first having to justify my underlying set of beliefs. So it becomes a way to get around doing important analytical work, because you can say, this is true from my lived experience, this is true from the fact that we're doing a postmodern through a Marxist lens, and that means you get away without doing the necessary analytical work to make academia good. Third, you use this to defend against attacks. You can say, well, you have this attack on my research, but that's just a different way of thinking. That just comes from a feminist perspective. I'm taking a Marxist perspective. That isn't a threat to me. The fact that Marxism exists isn't a threat to me. And that means that you can get away with more lazy research defending against critiques. That establishes why we get better research, which also means that it's more true research and indirectly flips opening opposition. Because when DLO talks about, aren't you glad that there are all of these good things like post-colonial modes of study, if you believe that post-colonial modes of study are good and true, which I do, then I believe that they would similarly exist in a world where there was proper analytical work done to establish whether or not they were true. So that beats opening government. It's a much better explanation of why we get better academic work. Second contribution from closing government. Yeah. You put it in the chat.
Okay. Why doesn't the incentive to critique each other and to create that competition exist in interdisciplinary studies, as we tell you? Because you want to approach things from as many perspectives as possible. That competition thing exists everywhere.
Yeah, so you want to approach things from as many perspectives as possible, but the existence of the Marxist critique under your side doesn't mean that the feminist critique isn't true, because these can just be competing theories based on different frameworks. Whereas under our side, there is only one truth. Marxism and feminism can't exist in parallel they can exist in parallel if they reach the same true conclusion. But if they're reaching disjoint conclusions, they can't exist in parallel without competing with each other. So now you have to critique and interact, and that critiquing and interaction is what makes both Marxism and feminism better. Second extension will explain and flip opening opposition and explain why there's actually more diversity. Because what opening opposition is talking about is we went from a world where there was a hegemonic set of academic ideas, and then we went to postmodernism. They say, well, therefore the counterfactuals would have remained at hegemonic ideas. We would say you still would have got more diverse ideas. You just would have had more diverse ideas through the lens of them all competing to be the truth, rather than the lens of them saying they are all equally valid. So you still would have had diverse ideas. You just wouldn't have had the idea that all of those diverse ideas are equally true. Why is it true that you still would have got a diversity on either side? First, all of the forces that existed to create postmodernism still would have existed, because OO has the causation the wrong way around. They think postmodernism was invented, and then everyone was like, hey, this is a great idea, we should consider alternative beliefs. No, what happened is there were a series of forces that wanted to create diversity of academic thought, and then postmodernism was the way that they were expressed. If we didn't have postmodernism, they would be expressed in a different way, which would have been a diversity of thought, but an acknowledgement that that diversity of thought were not all equally true, and that there was a truth that they were all getting at. The second reason we still would have had diverse thought is that academia has a drive for newness, so they want to get new ideas in order for you to get more research grants, in order for you to distinguish yourself amongst your colleagues. Third, we had social movements who were breaking down assumptions. The feminist movement was attacking those assumptions. They still would have attacked those assumptions. It's just that the feminist critique wouldn't have been a postmodernist one. Feminism is equally valid as everything else. It would have been a non-postmodernist diverse one. Feminism is more correct than the other things, and we can prove it, which makes the other things better and makes feminism better. But fourthly, there's a variety of things that happened in that time that broke down our existing assumptions that meant we had to go to more diverse ideas. Climate change, stagflation in the 80s, which broke our existing models, would necessarily have moved us towards a diverse set of ideas. And what I'd note is that counterfactual explains why opening opposition is wrong with their argument about diverse ideas. But I'd note it actually drives people away from fields that do diverse ideas. Because what you have at most universities is an economics department, which is fairly hegemonic, does mathematical stuff, and a political economy department, which considers more diverse perspectives. But when the political economy department exists now in a postmodern way, it pushes people from political economy towards economics. 3 reasons. First, it just makes the postmodern field, like political economy, seem silly. Secondly, it's easier to discredit. And third, the postmodern field is less appealing to students because it is less in line with what employers would want, because almost no employer wants you to do a postmodern field of analysis. So that means that on their side, they're actually pushing people away from the fields that study diverse perspectives, so they get less diverse perspectives on their side. Final extension will explain why this is massively discredited universities. And the context of this is that universities are under attack. The UK government is cutting funding. The Australian government is Republican presidential candidates are saying they're going to cut funding. So why is this a particularly effective critique of academia in a way that other critiques aren't? First, it's an attack that isn't split along lines of ideology. Because when you say academia is left-wing, that only applies to right-wing people. But this attack, academia doesn't care about truth, applies to everyone, which is why it's the most effective critique of universities. Secondly, it strikes at the core of academia in a way that the conclusions of academia or the methods of academia don't. You can have bad methods or bad conclusions and still be valuable, but if you don't care about truth, that strikes at the core of academia in a way that other critiques don't. And third, it is an actually true critique. This is what's being taught. This is what professors will say, we are studying in a postmodern way, and the fact that it is actually true gives it far more veracity. What are the impacts of this extension? It means university research isn't trusted. People don't make decisions on the basis of good university research. Secondly, there's defunding of universities. They can use it to say universities aren't useful anymore, we should cut them, which means there are less students, there's less research. And third, students think it's not for them, they don't go to university. On the weighing, this means that we cut out academia at all, which both sides would agree is a good on and of itself, and it gets at the part of academia that is obviously and uncontroversially good, which is uplifting people out of poverty.
Thank you so much for that fine speech. I would now like to invite the member of opposition, Bakker.
Cool. Can you hear me?
Yep.
I'm going to start with 4 extraneous pieces of rebuttal to closing government, and then our extension on how this uniquely gives us better data collection and better analysis of statistics. Let's start with CG, 4 responses. Firstly, Max like, postmodernism means people don't critique each other interdisciplinarity. Obviously they do. There is a reason why finance and political economy compete directly against each other, and it is because of postmodernism that allows that interdisciplinary conversation that gives those units incentives to work together. Literally, academic discourse exists, and postmodernism is the reason. OO already explained this. Second of all, they're like, they don't justify the truth. Obviously they do. It's bad academia if you don't justify your research. That's the thing that means that you don't get any citations. But also we'd posit that sometimes there just is no objective truth, and that is the benefit of postmodern research. It allows you to be subjective, and I'm going to explain that in my extension. Next, Matt's like, it's easier to discredit stuff and people don't hire you if you have these like postmodern degrees. Firstly, postmodern perspectives give people the option to opt into these degrees. Without postmodernism, you wouldn't even have the ability to discredit it because it wouldn't exist in the first place, and that in itself is a problem. But second of all, employees actively want people with these sort of interdisciplinary degrees that focused on postmodern thought because they're the things that bring them diversity, and that is what employers love. Secondly, let's talk about their stuff on funding, because this is absolutely rubbish. 3 responses. Firstly, under our side, more people opt into humanities, which means you have more students at your university, and more students equals more numbers. Note the fact that the perspective and empathy that OO talks about are the thing that allow people to opt into those arts degrees because they feel like there is a space from them. Note we do the impact that OO misses, which is that we actually get students in and we get money. Second of all, conservatives are always going to attack universities. It's not about sociology or postmodernism. It's about educational institutions in general. That is clearly not the tipping point. But thirdly, we note that these sort of postmodern perspectives gives more visceral and emotional like forms of academia and research. And they're the kind of things that people actually lean into as moderates because they're things that actually make them feel something. With all of that, CG is out of the round. Let's talk about why we get better data collection. That is the extension that we're going to bring you from closing opposition. Two claims. The first claim is that this gives a voice to perspectives that are otherwise silenced by objective studies because we do things like oral testimony and written testimony and create that kind of history. And the second extension is about how we interpret statistical data better, engaging in this debate in terms of science, which no other team has done. Firstly, let's explain why we get better data collection. Because note opening opposition's analysis is so thin here. They're like, we do feminist theories and anti-colonial stuff better when we use postmodernism. This debate isn't about what you study, it's about how you study it and how you research it and how you actually collect that data. We are going to explain to you that this is how the thing that changes, because OO's entire case is about discourse. Discourse means nothing, data means something. That is why we win the round. Why do we think we're able to get better data on our side that actually speaks to culture? The first thing we posit is that there is a limited amount of capital on the type of data that you're able to collect in the status quo. And that's because there are competing interests for that data. And at the point where postmodernism doesn't exist, it means that the type of data that is collected is purely objective and statistical, and that is data that we would regret only having. So why do we think we're able to get better data on our side? Firstly, because you're more likely to interview diverse perspectives through subjective data collection like oral history from everyday people. Because when under postmodernism, you value things like diversity and discourse, that means that you're more likely to opt into diverse forms of data collection, and that counterbalances the current narrative of domination of leaders. And we're going to point to two poignant examples. The first is the postmodern academia that exists in Bosnia after NATO's intervention, where instead of just using statistics and interviewing military officials, they instead went in on the ground and did focus groups and research groups, people who've been acutely impacted by that crisis. And it is that data that allowed people to have an empathetic understanding of what had happened in the Bosnian War. And that is actually what led to the outcomes that OO talks about. Because note that OO does the impacting without the mechanization. They never explain academically why it is that subjective data that you actually need. And that is the critical contribution that CO brings you in the round. Second example we'd point to is the Pacific Islands and how when they did research about the Pacific Islands after their crisis, it wasn't just about geography. It was focusing on archaeology and the lives that people lived there and the kind of materials that they used and the sort of like way that they rallied against climate change. And all of those things have led to important conversations and revelations in history and in science that would not have been possible without postmodern thought. Because the types of academics that would have done it under side government are the ones who are the most ousted from society. On our side, we bring that sort of discourse into the norm of academia, and that is really important. What is the impact of this? Firstly, it is validating for people to be talked to in community groups and have their perspective heard. Secondly, it means that future generations are more incentivized to do record keeping and data collection because they feel like that subjective data collection will actually be taken into account with legitimacy under academia when it would not without postmodernism. Thirdly, though, it corrects historical wrongs. We note the fact that the reason why so many native languages have been lost is because postmodernism didn't exist in university and you had no incentives to collect on subjective things. We uniquely allow the importance of collecting on those subjective and diverse things because it no longer becomes about utility. And panel, just note Matt's speech is literally like utility is important, supply demand important, that's the thing that gets you a degree. But what about so many languages that have been lost because you don't value them as things that have specific utility? We are the only team that explains that it's important to have that in mainstream academic discourse. Secondly, let's explain why the interpretation of statistical data is far better on our side. The first thing we're going to posit is that postmodernism leads to the better interpretation of scientific data in the way that you control it and you interpret it. And that's because now you are forced to actually reckon with the way that you create that data, you collect that data, and then you then use that data. Because at every point you have to interrogate the reason why you were doing it at the first place. You can no longer just use objectivity as a cloak of which to cover all of your data. Instead, you have to go in and interrogate it at every spot of the process. And that means you avoid blind spots. It means that you improve collection and interpretation, and that is a huge impact. I'll take opening.
So we will also improve data collection to better approximate the truth. But on your side, the dominance of subjectivity decreases accountability because when there's no universal standard, only the most famous researchers get their works published.
Okay, so that is literally the hamasha in government bench. Because when you are seeking a truth, that is when problems actually arise. Because the truth about data is that there are multiple different versions of the truth, and you can only access those at the point where you value subjectivity. The problem with objectivity is it means there's only one thing that comes out as the answer, and that is when the most privileged people end up getting the answers and the questions solved, and not the people that closing opposition actually cares about. What are the contributions that we've actually brought you at the end of this round, and why are they the most salient? First of all, we explained to you why you are more likely to interview people in authentic ways and collect data in a way that is oral and a way that is written and a way that the average reasonable person can understand and relate to. That brings people a huge amount of validation, but it also means we're able to unlock all of opening opposition's benefits by filling in that mechanistic gap that is so lacking in their case. But secondly, we explain that it forces you to interpret data in a way that is far more meaningful. And finally, we explain that without this narrative, you would only have postmodern research on the absolute edges of academia, as that POI correctly identifies. The problem with that is that only the most privileged people would ever get to, the least privileged people would get to do it. We bring it into the mainstream, and that is critical.
Amazing. Thank you for that very fine speech. To conclude Gov Bench, letting Branko leave here.
All right, hello, just give me a second.
Sure.
I'm going to do three things. Firstly, I'm going to defend the extension. Secondly, I'm going to provide a direct flip of closing opposition. And finally, I'm going to respond to opening opposition. Before I get into defending this extension, I want you to review your notes of Matt's speech, because virtually every piece of rebuttal that Bella gives is just take what Matt said, take out all of the preemption and all of the nuance, and provide a set of very generic debating rebuttal. And I think the vast majority has already been deleted preemptively. So the first thing I'm going to do is provide a preemptive defense against the claim that these new schools of thought would not get integrated into the mainstream understanding of universal truth. And the fact that they can coexist alongside other forms of truth is the reason why things like critical race theory and things like feminist politics were able to succeed in the first place. The first thing I'd say to this is that this is an extremely unambitious view of academia. Even if it is harder to integrate these other schools of thought into a mainstream understanding of universal truth in politics or universal truth in anthropology, in the long term, the drivers behind the social movements that create forces of change, things like feminism, things like quests for Black justice, those movements in the long term integrate into things like mainstream academia. So even if our benefit takes longer to accrue, I think we give you a series of reasons why this more ambitious vision of academia is far more likely to actualize into better policy, is far more likely to actualize into a better experience for university students and a better version of the quest for truth. But secondly, I think this underestimates the integrity that academics have. That is, they dedicate their lives to pursuing truth, and they don't ignore things just because it's not what they currently believe. So the set of academics who did not previously consider things like critical race theory and things like feminist politics, those academics do actually consider the nuance and the integrity of these claims and critiques against their particular schools of thoughts and have incentives to integrate them. But thirdly, I would point out that there are competitive incentives between academics in terms of being published to be on the cutting edge and integrate these critiques into their understanding of politics and their understanding of their fields. That is, they want to provide the most novel and interesting ideas, and journals want to publish the most controversial and interesting ideas that are the most novel. What that suggests to you is we land by far the clearest and largest impact on the round, because the best version of academia that these other teams are able to promise is one in which feminist anthropology exists, feminist politics exist, but it is relegated
relegated to a separate field of study that is not integrated into other visions of politics. We provide a more ambitious and better version of this, in which our understanding of truth is fundamentally altered to be inclusive of the groups that they say need to be included in academia. Next, let's respond to some direct critiques we get from Bella. Firstly, they claim that critiques occur on both sides between different fields and between different fields of study. I would note that we explain to you a set of reasons why there is more critique on our side. That is, there is no longer the case where two fields of study like feminist anthropology and Marxist anthropology can coexist alongside each other. So there is fundamentally a more nuanced and more integrated version of each vision of anthropology and of politics that ends up being produced. And Bella's only mechanism to explain why critique occurs counterfactually is to say, well, obviously that it does. But secondly, even if critique occurs on both sides between different fields, that critique is never actualized because people do discussions of which version or which perspective is true, but they never actually integrate those perspectives into one another, so it isn't a useful form of critique. Thirdly, they say, well, it's bad academia to not justify your perspective. This misunderstands what postmodernism does, because to analyze something through a feminist framework or to analyze something through a Marxist framework, you have to draw from an existing set of feminist or Marxist heuristics and build your analysis of whatever it is you're studying through that perspective from there, which means you never actually assess whether that perspective needs to be improved, and you never do the competition between different perspectives to understand what is good. And it's only a very small subset of academia that is doing that critique. Fourthly, they say there are still attacks on universities. Right-wing people still want to do cuts to things like the arts. Firstly, we explain that this is a much better form of that critique because it doesn't just attack the ideology that academics have, which could be left-wing or could be right-wing. It attacks fundamentally what academics are doing because it allows politicians to say they aren't even finding what is true. They are just analyzing things through different perspectives and discussing things in the abstract. And they're able to say that this is not actualizing into a useful form of policy because they aren't coalescing into some form of actionable change. They are just providing different perspectives on existing things that have already been studied, which is far less useful. But secondly, I would say, sure, there might still be explained what critiques on both sides, but those critiques get far better. Now, let's provide a direct flip of closing opposition, because their extension is you get more data collection because you believe different perspectives are real. This misunderstands what finding a universal truth means, because a universal truth is not a white truth. It is a collective truth of humanity, which means in order to find something and understand politics through the framework of, for example, American society, a non-postmodernist approach tells you that you cannot just relegate separately class and race. You must find an understanding of politics, an understanding of economics that integrates those two things fundamentally into a vision of American politics and a vision of an American economy, which explains to you why actually the reverse of this is true. There is very little incentive to seek out, for example, whatever is happening in Bosnia if it is not relevant to the moral truth that exists for a Western institution. Because if my white perspective on the world is fundamentally different to the perspective of a Polynesian person, it is not relevant to me what that Polynesian person has experienced. But if we are part of a greater collective vision of the truth, we are far, far more likely to care about what that is. Because to understand my moral truth, I must understand your moral truth and integrate those things together to find a greater vision of reality. Before I respond to opening opposition, I'll take opening.
Yeah, your whole case tries to construct a world in academia that does not exist. Why are you allowed to have a counterfactual when this debate is about whether postmodernism as it exists is good or not? We provide so much.
Why are we allowed to have a counterfactual? Because it's a fucking debate. We're asking a world where academia had not become a postmodernist. We are arguing what that would have looked like. Next, let's respond to opening opposition. Their first claim is that this has led to less novel schools of thought. Firstly, I would point out that a lot of the things that have caused the schools of thoughts that they talk about are endogenous to the world. Things like critical race theory emerged from a broader movement for civil rights and black justice. Feminist perspectives on anthropology and politics emerged from a broader second wave feminist movement, which suggests that counterfactually, academics would have integrated these things into a universal truth. But secondly, I would point out that separating these things into different fields makes it much easier to not teach and include these perspectives. Because if feminist politics is distinct from the rest of politics, you make it a separate subject. And then when university management and politics goes after feminism, they're able to cut those subjects and relegate them to not being core units, which means students actually don't get the opportunity to learn them. If they instead are direct critiques of all politics, they get integrated into other politics courses and actually get taught to students. And this also applies to research, because it means you can divide into separate divisions within faculties, an academic who is in charge of feminist anthropology and an academic who is in charge of Marxist anthropology, which means you can cut the tenure of that academic who is in charge of feminist anthropology and remove their job. And the reason why those broader social movements don't apply here is because academia is fundamentally fundamentally more progressive and more left-wing than the management and the government which oversee them, which means that academia is likely to integrate it. And at the point where all of academia has integrated these perspectives, it is far, far harder to cut them without cutting all of academia. For these reasons, very, very proud to govern.
I was talking to myself, sorry. Thank you very much for the fine speech. To conclude the entire debate, I would now like to invite the Weep here.
Hey, just double checking the room. Can you hear me? Ooh.
Yep. Yeah.
Oh, that's good. I apologize for the Australian example, but in Australia, when the government was trying to set up the best possible policy to implement education programs for Indigenous students, the thing that they tried, based on a whole bunch of empirical studies and data, was to just fund those Indigenous schools more. This really had surprisingly weak returns given the amount of funding from it. And it was only after multiple years of postmodern studies that explored the feeling of alienation of Indigenous students in those English language classrooms that the state government began to realize that it was the fact that these students were not speaking and learning in their Indigenous tongues that had largely been lost to history. Those individuals were not receiving the results that they ought have. And this is the big problem with the government case. The core big benefit they try to claim is like better academia leads to better policy and better society, without a good explanation about why data is the sole and only way to achieve good results and good informed policy. Because the problem is that data can be interpreted in many, many different ways. Of course, a lack of funding was one of the issues that Indigenous students face, but postmodernism is a very useful additional tool to further improve the accuracy of that policy. And this is the explanation Bella gives you. First, an explanation that it not just provides a huge amount of perspectives to be able to gather the awareness, the emotional position of the cultural history of individuals and how they engage in a series of government policies, but, and that extra perspective is what helps enhance policy decision making. But it is secondly, perhaps more directly to this government bench, that it forces the empiricists, it forces those statistical studies to better justify and prove their own pieces. And if Toomey wants to get up there and talk extensively about deflecting and not responding to criticism, then they should have responded to our case, which explained why this forces those statistical studies to better justify, actually, is this just a confounded variable? To listen to the testimony of individuals on the ground and match their data to explain people's experiences. We say that this is an important additional tool that is a valuable form of critique and a valuable form of challenge that went unresponded to. What else does opening government say in this debate? They say, postmodern perspectives are likely to not be entirely accurate or a little bit phony. They say you're still going to have Western-centric positions and you're still going to have structural biases. I'm going to be clear, you do not, it's not a failure if you don't become one with an Indigenous perspective and perfectly see through their moral lens or whatever. To also be clear, when Charlie gets up there and is just the government team cannot just support you empathizing with someone else's moral truth, right? Their team must support that there is one objective truth and other individuals' moral truth are wrong in this debate. And that, I think, is a serious loss because, as we explained, the very act of trying to empathize, the very act that even it's not just about you, it's about recording individuals' histories, about sharing the oral history Pacific Islanders, about giving a voice to those individuals that have not been able to have that voice written down and shared to other people. And it's not even just about pragmatics. It's about just the fact that those cultures and those individuals have been silenced for so long that needs to be addressed. The last thing that OG says is, but we get better research because there's more standardization and there's more objectivity here. This standardization and objectivity is really bad. It's really, really harmful to academia. And the core reason is because it prevents the type of provocative or emerging research by claiming that it is illegitimate, because it is not following a series of standard tests, because it is not objective and therefore fulfilling certain types of metrics that individuals believe are normal or commonplace. That is why oral histories and testimonies have been relegated in academic studies for so many decades, because they were seen as a lesser form of study that is just a small sample size of individuals' experiences and non-representative. We say that these experiences are valuable, and the fact that these standardized objective tests have denied them from adding to the academia has been deeply regrettable in society. But what then? Why then do we beat our opening opposition in this debate? I think the core weakness of opening opposition is they're just quite uncharitable to the core government line, that it's obviously not like they don't get any feminist or colonial studies. The real question is whether they use objective tools, like using data to study intergenerational effects on crime rates, or rather people's experiences and testimony on the ground. And as such, I think it makes us much more responsive to their case, and we therefore can claim many of the benefits of opening government on better policy making that our opening cannot. Let's then get and deal with closing government, but before then, I'll take opening government.
So you offered specific examples of people incorporating specific indigenous voices, but we told you general structural reasons why there are various other cases that are unproductive and detached from reality.
I'll get to that when addressing CG, actually, because I think CG makes two broad arguments and two broad contributions on better academia. I think core as a benefit here is all about critiques and deflections. And I think they're really fixated on this argument about, like, if we get more critiques, we get a better academia. And I'm like, kind of like, why? Like, firstly, often these critiques are terrible, and they're terrible for the reason that you need to deny other theories' truth, right? To be clear, current academia works that you still contest the truth of certain claims. For instance, you still say that this statistical study has made certain mistakes in certain ways, but there is no existential need to fundamentally say that Marxist theory is wrong because there is only one moral truth. We think criticism in many ways is non-functional. It is unproductive, and we prefer less of it. But second is that we can still find value even within that type of criticism that is given. That is simply for the fact that we reckon that individuals deflecting to some degree that oral histories are just small sample size is totally fine. The reason is because we recognize that those things are not the objective truth. That is, that we accept that this not is the sole or only thing. And as such, we are aware of many of the limitations of postmodern studies. For instance, when Toomey gets up there and it's just like, you never proved this Marxist theory. Like, I don't know, have you tried to prove Marxist theory? I would kind of say it's a little bit impossible. It's like proving feminism. The reasons is that these are types of things that have fundamental limitations that cannot be comprehensively proved in the way that government team sets an impossible standard of. That people are not stupid. They're aware of that. They understand that there are fundamental limitations and they work around them. The problem with their side is objectivity is a sole authority, and you must therefore have those types of proofs. People are not stupid under our side. The last big problem with closing government is a question of funding. And this argument has really got me a bit perplexed because I'm pretty confident it's a knife. And that is because, to the best of my understanding, there is no postmodern physics or engineering. And as such, opening government very overtly in this debate said, arts cuts are good. Closing government's argument is, arts cuts are really, really bad. And therefore, I'm pretty sure if I rebut this argument from CG, I'm just going to help out opening government. And as such, I think at the end of this day, the real central question is on which team gets better academia. We've explained how we get better interpretations of data, which is the true reason why we get better academia in this debate.
Amazing. I would like to thank the speaker for their fine speech. And with that, we've come to the end of the debate. Congratulations again. Thank you all for your wonderful speeches. Results will obviously be released. So you can virtually cross the aisle and shake hands for sure. Okay.
Thank
I'm
you.
just gonna.
Thanks, everyone.
Hi everyone. Just wanted to announce a few things from OC. So we might push closing ceremony a bit earlier. We're hoping for 8:30 just so that we can all be done with this. We will update Discord 5 minutes before that. But yeah, so we are moving earlier, closing ceremony, possibly 8:30. Hopefully everything goes well, but so far everything's been prepared. But just to announce to everyone, it might be 8:30. Thank you so much. Sorry, go continue whatever. Thank you.
Gabriel, can you tell me what the time is right now in the Philippines? I need to have an idea of how much time we have.